Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Luffy stuck in Government Academy and tried to find his crew? Before I start, please do support for more awesome content, and subscribe my channel and like this video. Go support and follow the Olivia Wren for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story. Link in the description. Monkey D, Luffy? He peered over his glasses at the man before him, then glanced back at the sheaf of papers in his hand. A deep hum rumbled from him, leather chair creaking as he leaned back. He rubbed a gold-ringed finger contemplatively against his lips before he sighed and closed the folder, setting it delicately on his desk as he turned to face his friend. Garp. The grizzled man grinned sheepishly. Sengoku. I know what his record looks like, but it's just a rebellious phase. He just needs the appropriate grooming to take my place. Sengoku sighed heavily and pinched his nose. Garp, I already got ace admitted despite his less than stellar record. Now you want me to do the same for your grandson? He eyed him, explaining one unusual admittance was hard enough. Now you want me to do it a second time? Garp laughed, teeth flashing. Oh, come on, Sengoku. You know you owe me. He grinned widely. Unless you want me to tell people about. No, I do not. How long are you going to hold that ridiculousness over me? He shook his head and threw his hands up in defeat. Very well. But Garp, he pointed a finger sternly at him, you better not be hiding any more children up those sleeves, or I'm going to have to open another school. He waved a hand at his friend and sighed, grinning reluctantly. Now get out of here, you old coot. I have to come up with a good enough excuse for our board in order to get your delinquent of a grandson admitted to this school. Agof. Grandpa, I told you I don't want to go to school. Luffy pulled his blue tie away from his chest and frowned down at it. His grandfather's smack to the back of his head made him bend nearly in half. Sitting up straight again and rubbing at it, he glared up at him. What the hell was that for? You're going to school, Luffy. It's the only way you'll get to a position like mine. He flipped the turn signal, then smacked Luffy's head again. The boy hissed and Garp merely said, no more cursing like a sailor either. Honestly, you and Ace picked up such terrible habits at Curly's. I never should have let her watch you two when I went off for business trips. Luffy muttered several sufficiently sailor-like litanies as he glared out the tinted window, but luckily his grandfather wasn't listening. Now, you need to get your act together. It wasn't easy getting you into this academy, and it'll be hard work staying there unless you bring your skills up. He pulled up to the curb, the brakes bringing them to a smooth stop in the luxury sedan, and then he shoved Luffy's backpack into his arms. All right, kid. Get going. Luffy rolled his eyes and opened the door, sliding his backpack onto his shoulder carelessly. He slammed the heavy doors shut, the sleek black paint hiding the seam perfectly, but turned to glance back when he heard the window being rolled down, only to behold his grandfather's furious face. Get back here, you little cretin! I told you not to wear flip-flops today. Luffy grinned, but then he saw what his grandfather was grabbing from the leather interior, and his eyes widened as he turned, trying to run. Luffy, get back here! With instincts born of a lifetime with the man, Luffy ducked and the full mug of scalding coffee sailed over his head, only for it to slam into the kid in front of him. Ah! The kid dropped his backpack and arched his back, trying to get the steaming liquid off his skin. Cars behind Garp's were honking at him. He looked like he might pop a blood vessel as he yelled at his grandson again. Don't think I'll forget this. I'll see you tonight. Then he peeled out of the drop-off lane, leaving tire marks on the pavement. Luffy breathed a sigh of relief as the sedan vanished, other cars pulling up to the curb to take its place. He then walked over to the pink-haired kid and clapped his soggy back with a laugh. Ha ha ha, wow, I'm glad I didn't get hit by that. The kid turned his glasses-framed face to him in incredulity, and Luffy rubbed at his shaggy black hair sheepishly. Sorry. That looked like it was hot. The boy sighed heavily, his dripping jacket sagging in his hands as his shoulders drooped. Oh, it's alright, I'm used to it. Luffy stared at him in confusion. You're used to getting hit with hot coffee mugs? Not quite. I'm just used to getting hit. The boy rubbed at his head in embarrassment, then wiped the coffee from his other hand on a dry part of his shirt before he held it out to Luffy. I'm Kobe. What's your name? Luffy grasped Kobe's hand with a wide grin. Monkey D. Luffy. I'm going to be the Pirate King. Kobe's jaw dropped past the coffee-soaked collar of his white button-down. You what? He glanced at the majestic marble building in front of them, at the name blazoned over the door, then back at Luffy's grinning face. You do realize where you are, right? Luffy laughed and clapped Kobe's wet shoulder as he turned him toward the wide-open double doors before them. Kobe's protests that it was impossible trailed behind them as they proceeded into the World Justice Academy. Luffy's gaze roved across the field, attention decidedly not held by the less-than-fair fight taking place before them. His hand smushed his cheek into a lump where he rested his face against it. He rested one ankle on his opposite knee, flip-flop-clad foot bouncing impatiently as he grumbled under his breath. This was supposed to be a demonstration of the skills they'd learn, but so far it hadn't been very interesting. Each student was evidently a second year or above, but Professor Tashigi was still kicking their asses and had yet to break a sweat. There were quite a few dirt and grass stains decorating the challengers' clothes. He was entertaining thoughts of skipping out as he eyed the remaining candidates. His belief that the rest of the class would be boring was reinforced by every sweaty-faced student until he caught sight of the guy taking a nap. He perked up, head lifting from his hand, and called behind him, "Hey, Kobe, who's that?" Kobe spared a glance in his direction, unwilling to be torn from the bout taking place before him, but then his eyes widened when he realized who Luffy was talking about. Oh no. That's Roronoa Zoro. He's a troublemaker. People call him Pirate Hunter because he's already taken down some pirate bounties even though he's not in his official apprenticeship yet. He trailed off at the grin growing across Luffy's face. When Luffy turned that grin toward him and prompted him to keep going with an aha, Kobe started shaking his head. Nua. No way. Don't even think about it, Luffy-senpai. You can't possibly be friends with him, it's impossible. Impossible. Impo www. Kobe rubbed at the lump on his head and peered at Luffy through teary eyes. Luffy-senpai. What was that for? Luffy frowned thoughtfully, then said, no reason. Kobe whined for a moment, then sighed and smiled hesitantly. It's alright. I'm used to it. He shook his head again. Really, though, you shouldn't get mixed up with him. That guy is bad news. Professor Tashigi eventually called an end to the sword practice, telling them they should all get showered and dressed for their next class. Luffy pouted, but stood still as everyone around him trickled back into the building, Kobe casting one last glance at him before disappearing into the boys' locker room. So Luffy was the only one still standing there, staring at this Roronoa Zoro, when the green-haired boy cracked an eye open to stare back. Luffy just grinned. Luffy swung his black backpack in a circle, flip-flops slapping against the concrete as he walked down the sidewalk. The cuffs of his black dress pants bunched around his ankles, picking up some dirt as they hissed across the ground with each step. Kobe cringed. Luffy-senpai, you really should roll your pants up. The uniforms are expensive and I don't want you to have to buy a new one. Luffy laughed. It's fine, Kobe. Don't worry about it. He quirked his head as they came upon an alley, muffled noises coming from the middle of it. He turned to look, backpack still swinging, until he saw a collection of familiar swords on the ground at the alley entrance, and he slowed to a stop. He stared curiously at the swords, then lifted his gaze to the scene taking place before them, the ends of his navy blue tie swinging behind his head from where he'd secured it around his forehead like a headband. Kobe stood nervously behind him, staring unhappily down the alley, flinching with every blow that landed on an unresisting body. He glanced at Luffy's face, but it had gone oddly blank, and like all the expressions he'd seen on this boy's face so far, something about it worried him. He reached out and tugged gently on the sleeve of Luffy's black jacket. Luffy-senpai, we should go. That's the student police force, who metes out justice on behalf of the student government, and keeps peace on the campus. He must have done something wrong. The words stopped in his throat as he caught sight of something big and brown stalking around the alley. He gulped. They aren't. There shouldn't be wolves on campus. Luffy's eyes flicked to the light at the other end of the alley, where there was indeed a wolf prowling. His gaze was caught by different movement, though. A little girl huddled against the wall of one of the buildings there, legs drawn up and arms hugging them tightly to her chest. She was crying silently, skin showing scrapes and bruises and the edges of her dress in tatters. Luffy's grip tightened around the strap of his backpack hanging in his hand, and then, to Kobe's horror, he reared his arm back and flung the bag down the alley, right into the wolf, who went flying out of the other end of the alley and into the street. Ah! One of the student police officers turned to stare at the wolf, which looked like it might have been knocked out. He turned ever so slowly to face the other end of the alley, blonde bob framing wide eyes that stared at where a satisfied Luffy stood in front of a very shocked Kobe. You! The blonde boy pointed at them, gold rings flashing on his fingers. How dare you hurt my pet? He turned to the three students behind him, two of whom were holding Roronoa Zoro while the third had been pummeling him. Take care of him too. They glanced uncertainly at each other, but one of them grabbed both of Zoro's arms and held them behind the swordsman's back, securing them with zip ties, while the other two approached Luffy and Kobe. They wore the same uniform Luffy and Kobe did, but with the addition of a blue and white band around their right biceps that held the World Justice Academy's symbol twined with the world government's. Yee! Luffy-senpai! Kobe shuffled behind Luffy and tugged again on his jacket. Why did you do that? We really shouldn't get mixed up in this. Let's go. He pulled ineffectually at the taller boy's jacket, but Luffy merely shrugged out of it, causing Kobe to stumble a few feet before he caught himself. He stared at the premium black fabric in his hands, then slowly turned back to look incredulously at Luffy. Luffy had rolled up the white sleeves of his button-down shirt, a wide grin gracing his face as he unbuttoned his collar and raised his fists. Kobe tried to shout out a warning to him as the two upperclassmen descended, but the words vaporized from his throat as he watched Luffy's response. Those movements, the skills he displayed. Who was he? Those weren't the skills of a first year. Wide eyes blinked once behind thick glasses and the two students were already down and out. Kobe's jaw dropped, his expression perfectly mirrored on Helmeppo-senpai. I think we should leave. The third student was still holding Zoro up by his arms, but it looked like his grip was loosening as the panic on his face grew. Luffy bent forward and picked up the swords laying at his feet, dusting the sheaths off carefully. He started walking toward Helmeppo, head bowed, hair hiding his eyes. Helmeppo took a hesitant step back, then turned and bolted to the other end of the alley, disappearing around the corner. Luffy took one look at the student holding Zoro's arms and the boy bolted as well, dumping the swordsman into a heap on the ground. Zoro landed heavily on his shoulder, his black jacket only providing protection from scrapes but not from producing yet another bruise on his arm. A grunt escaped his lips at the impact, and his body tensed to try to protect his ribs. He turned his face to give Luffy a sidelong glance from the ground. Who the hell are you? But Luffy didn't answer, only continued walking past Zoro until he was in front of the little girl. She stared up at him apprehensively, eyeing the sheathed swords he still gripped in his hand. She leaned back into the wall as he crouched until he was at her level and he grinned widely, arms draped over his knees, and asked, "Are you okay?" Zoro watched silently as the girl started crying harder, then lunged forward and buried her face in Luffy's shirt. He rocked back onto the heels of his flip-flops a bit, and then he started rubbing her back with his free hand and saying, It's all right, now. Hey, stop, why are you crying? You're fine. Zoro blinked owlishly, then sighed and started sitting up until he was leaning back against the wall, one leg bent and the other sticking straight out into the alley, black boots peeking out from the ends of his dress pants. He wiggled until his arms were setting somewhat comfortably behind him and then let himself rest there for a moment, breathing carefully around already broken, and now additionally bruised, ribs until he heard Luffy muttering, "You should go find your parents. Go on, those guys won't hurt you again." Zoro cracked open an eye to see the boy's grinning face as they both watched the girl scamper toward her backpack, which had gotten thrown into the alley when that stupid wolf had jumped on her. She snatched it up quickly and started to turn away, but paused when she caught sight of Zoro watching her. She stared a moment, then her shoulders straightened and she trotted over to him. He sat perfectly still, slouched against the wall, his untucked white shirt barely moving as he breathed as shallowly as possible to protect his battered body. The girl leaned over him, careful not to touch him until she planted a very gentle kiss on his cheek. She giggled at his confused stare, and then raced off down the alley, turning one last time to grin and wave at them both before she was out of sight. Before he knew it, Luffy was walking past him again, back toward the pink-haired kid at the other end of the alley. Zoro leaned forward, wincing past the pain in his chest and only barely paying attention to the fact that his arms were still zip-tied behind his back as he called out, "Hey, you." Luffy paused, head tilting just enough to indicate that he was listening, although Zoro couldn't see his face. His 3 gold earrings tapped against his neck as he leaned forward some more and breathed out, "Those swords are mine." Luffy lifted the swords to examine them, then rested them on his shoulder, hilts peeking over the top next to his head. The ends of his blue Taigon headband swung as he turned his head to show Zoro a wicked grin. "Nah, I think I'll be keeping these." Zoro's eyes widened and he tried to roll to his feet, but he went down on a knee with a hiss as he felt something shift in his chest. Picking a fight when I'm already injured was probably not the best idea. He braced himself briefly, then surged to his feet and stumbled toward Luffy, though all he managed was to slam his shoulder into the wall. He was closer to the kid though, and upright, so he chose to stay put and rest. Just for a moment, he opened his mouth, but before he could say anything they both heard the pound of running feet at the end of the alley. They turned to look, only to see what appeared to be the rest of the student police force standing there, Helmeppo at its head. The boy pointed a gold-ringed finger at them and shouted, "It was them. They attacked us." The students started running toward them, but when Luffy glanced at Zoro, the rest of the world dropped into slow motion. "Hey!" Zoro's eyes slid to look at the black-haired kid and he found himself concerned with the new smile there. Still wicked, but this one he grinned back warily. "What? I'll make you a deal." He jerked his left shoulder, the sword sheaths clicking against each other as he jostled them. I'll give these back if you join my pirate crew. Zoro stared blankly at him for a moment, then scanned him, noting the pieces of his uniform. Pirate crew for someone going to the academy? He quirked a brow. Luffy merely grinned wider and spared a single glance at the advancing students. Or I could leave you with them. Zoro leaned his head back against the concrete behind him and a tired smirk slid across his face. What are you, the devil's son? He received nothing in response except a chuckle, so he lifted his head, earrings chiming as they hit one another. Fine. As long as you don't get in my way to become the greatest swordsman in the world. Luffy laughed and drew one of the swords. Zoro turned to present his hands and Luffy cut the zip tie as he said, I would expect nothing less from the crewmate of the Pirate King. Zoro's eyes widened, but he didn't have any more time to react to the claim as Luffy dropped the swords into his freed hands and the students descended on them. Luffy wouldn't stop laughing and Zoro wouldn't stop cursing. How had he wound up with these two anyway? Kobe's shoulders drooped and he pulled another bandage out of the kit, then reached warily around Zoro as he pulled it tight to brace the man's ribs. Ag! Zoro clenched his fist and Kobe flinched, but the man did nothing more than slam it into the bench he was sitting on. Luffy laughed harder and Zoro's eyebrow twitched. He grinned evilly and muttered breathlessly, Why don't you come a little closer, Captain? Sorry. Luffy wiped the tears of mirth out of the corners of his eyes, then set his hands back down to brace himself on the concrete between his swinging legs. He smiled at Kobe and leaned forward on his ledge. You're pretty good at this. Where'd you learn first aid? Kobe smiled sadly. Oh, well, I get all of the crappy jobs. Alvida-sama doesn't keep useless people around, so I had to learn how to do something other than clean. Alvida? Who is that? Luffy stared at the back of Kobe's pink head in puzzlement. Zoro quirked a brow at the small boy in front of him, intrigued. You mean that Alvida? You work for her? He paused when the boy flinched, then asked curiously, voice rumbling against Kobe's trembling hands as they continued tying bandages around his ribs. Isn't that against Academy rules? Kobe turned fearful eyes up to him. I know it's not what. Zoro turned to glance at Luffy, who was frowning and had crossed his arms, though his legs continued to swing. Hey! Who is this Alvida? Kobe had frozen like a deer in the headlights, so Zoro took the last bandage from his hands and tied it himself, hissing through the pain. She's a pirate with ties to the local crime bosses. She keeps a presence in town. He eyed the frightened Kobe as he pulled on his shirt, though he ran out of steam before he could button it shut. It didn't matter how many times he got them. Broken ribs always hurt, and getting broken ribs further pounded on only exacerbated the problem. He closed his eyes and leaned against the back of the bench before he continued. Working for any criminal is against Academy rules, but anyone who works for pirates in particular really gets the hammer. Kobe knocked the first aid kit over as he scrambled back from them both. Please don't tell them. I can't get into the naval program at the academy if they know I've worked for her. Zoro cracked a single eye open to peek at Kobe, then he shut it again with a heavy sigh. It doesn't matter to me, kid. Kobe stared at him, then turned hesitantly to Luffy. Luffy-senpai? But Luffy was playing with his tie again, and had somehow managed to knot it around both of his hands. He was still frowning at the mess in puzzlement when he looked up and asked, What are we talking about? Zoro chuckled. Zoro finally sighed and glanced over his shoulder. Why are you following me home? Luffy shrugged and tucked his hands behind his head, staring at the buildings around them. No reason. Zoro watched him a moment longer. His backpack dangled haphazardly off one shoulder, but he'd finally draped his tie back around his neck. His jacket, however, was tied around his waist. Zoro just shrugged and continued on. He probably looked no better, with both his jacket and shirt open over his chest and his 3 swords hanging from his belt. They could look like gang members for all he cared. He slid his hands into his pockets and hunched slightly, grimacing in pain. They strolled along silently then until they reached a ramshackle apartment complex, where Zoro fished out a key and unlocked the iron gate and the door behind it. Luffy stepped in behind the swordsman and eyed the dimly lit hallway curiously. He followed Zoro up the narrow stairs, humming thoughtfully, hands still tucked behind his head. Zoro glanced back at him once before opening another door. Johnny, Yosaku, I'm back. Zoro Aniki. Zoro collapsed onto his bed with a grunt, his bandaged chest bared to the ceiling. He pointed vaguely at the doorway, where Luffy was examining a display of swords, and said, Meet my captain. Johnny and Yosaku shared a confused look, then stood together, drawing Luffy's gaze to them. I'm Johnny, and I'm Yosaku. They stood side by side and crossed their arms, saying proudly in unison as they stood between Zoro's bed on one side and their bunk beds on the other, We're bounty hunters. Luffy grinned at them and placed his hands on his hips. I'm Monkey D. Luffy. I'm going to be the Pirate King. The two stared incredulously at him, then started laughing. Johnny, half bent with laughter, turned to look at Zoro while he pointed at Luffy. Zoro and Ikki, that was a good joke. Meet my captain. Ha ha. As if you join a pirate crew with such a pipsqueak as your captain. Zoro yawned and frowned faintly at Johnny. Joke? Johnny's laughter trailed off, but it was Yosaku whose jaw dropped and he asked, Wait, you're being serious? He shoved Johnny's head down so he could lean over him to give Zoro a wild-eyed look. He pointed sideways at Luffy. You joined a pirate crew led by this kid? What about your ambition? Zoro smirked. You heard him. He's going to be the Pirate King. He's going to need the greatest swordsman in the world on his crew. His gaze slid back to Luffy, who grinned as Zoro asked, Isn't that right? Johnny surged up from under Yosaku, knocking his brother over, to glare at the now laughing kid standing in front of their flimsy apartment door. He pointed at him again. How dare you take Aniki away from us? He stood straighter and put his other hand on his hip, the ends of his blue sweatshirt swinging with his raised arm. I challenge you to a duel. Luffy's laughing slowed, but a quiet grin remained on his face. Oh, Zoro felt bad for Johnny. She slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. Brown eyes glanced down at the piece of paper in her hand and then she gripped it a little tighter, mouth firming in determination. Turning her head to press her ear to the door, she waited, hoping the footsteps would recede. They didn't. She stepped away from the door just before it burst open behind her. Orange hair swayed around her chin as she spun to face her pursuers, a tense smile on her face. What now, you idiots? She gestured to the open rooftop around them. You've chased me all the way up here, but what exactly do you hope to do? The two goons looked at each other, then gave her greasy smiles. Well, Nei-chan, we're all alone up here. We can do whatever we want. She opened her mouth to shoot back a retort, but she paused when she caught movement behind the two men standing before her. Who the hell is that? She stared for a moment at the boy wearing a straw hat, laying on his stomach above the door. He looked like he might be a student. She grinned and waved at him. Hey, boss. It's good to see you. Can you take care of these two idiots? The boy's face scrunched up in confusion, chin resting in his hand as his legs waved idly in the air behind him. Yes? Nami sat on her surprise at the response, and merely ducked between the two men, bolting through the rooftop door and locking it from the inside. Luffy stared down at the door underneath him, a frown on his face. So you're her boss, huh? Luffy hummed thoughtfully to himself as he looked at the two men before him, still frowning. And if the clouds look, crash. Professor Hairdos turned toward the classroom door, blinking to keep the cloud of dust out of his eyes. He stroked idly at his long gray beard, pulling faint puffs of dust from it as he said, Hey, what's going on here? Nami stared incredulously at the figure rising from the dust. She had nearly convinced herself it was impossible when the wavering shadow solidified into the kid from the rooftop. He bent and picked up his straw hat from the debris of the door and brushed it off, placing it back on his head. What's with those guys anyway? He whined, brushing off his black suit jacket as well. I didn't do anything to them. The class gasped collectively as a fist came out of the dust cloud behind him, straight for his head. But where had he gone? Nami's eyes dropped to the ground. The kid had bent so far backward that he was resting his hands on the ground. He grinned widely, then raised his legs from the ground, grabbing the figure in the cloud around the chest on the way, and finished his backflip, slamming his attacker's head into the ground with a meaty thump. Nami flinched back when something landed on her desk, but her hammering heart slowed when she realized it was just the straw hat. She stared at it for a moment, then raised her head as she heard the boy muttering, Hat? Hat? Where'd you go? He was patting at his head frantically, looking at the ground and trying to wave dust out of the way so he could see better. Hey, I think it's over there. The boy looked up at Professor Hairdos, who was smiling kindly and pointing at Nami's desk while his other hand continued to shake dust off of his long black robe. The boy's dark eyes lit up when he spotted the hat and he smiled. Hey, my hat! He trotted toward it, the sound of his flip-flops slapping the ground strangely incongruous with the destruction in his wake. Nami knocked over her chair in her haste to stand as he came closer, but the boy simply grabbed his hat and placed it securely on his head. When he looked up again he grinned widely and turned to Professor Hairdos. Thanks. Then he shoved his hands in his pockets and just walked out of the classroom, whistling tunelessly. Hey, Professor Hairdos stared at the shattered doorway for a moment, then turned back to the chalkboard and continued drawing. So if the clouds look like this. Every time she thought she'd pinned down his habits, he threw a wrench into her plans. She'd gone back to the roof, but hadn't seen him there again. She didn't know who he was, so he had to be a first year for sure. She'd asked around some of the first-year students, but only got a few tidbits of information. She tried dropping in on the first-year swordsmanship class because he'd been seen there before, but it looked like he was skipping it these days. No one in his class had seen him lately. She thought she caught sight of his hat once or twice, but every time she tried to get close enough to talk to him, he wasn't there anymore. She was feeling distinctly like she had hallucinated him and had decided to drown her frustration in coffee, sitting at the window bar of the cafe, staring petulantly at the passers-by. So she nearly spewed her coffee into the glass when she saw him across the street. He was walking and laughing with some pink-haired kid wearing glasses. She frowned. A friend, maybe? But where have I seen him before? Oh. She blinked, then chuckled. She was practically skipping when she left the coffee shop. Kobe should have been paying more attention to the unusual whispers coming from his classroom, but he was far more preoccupied with reviewing material for his test when he walked in the door and headed for his seat. So it came as quite the surprise when he tried to set his backpack on his desk and found a girl in the way. A very attractive girl, who also appeared to be one of the upperclassmen. Kobe stumbled back until he hit another desk, his hands flying to brace himself against it, sending his flashcards scattering like flower petals around him. The girl was sitting on top of his desk, one leg crossed over the other, her black skirt scandalously high to bare her thigh. She was resting both of her elbows on her knee, hands hanging in front of them, head tilted, regarding him with a smug smile. He had the unnerving feeling that he was a mouse being confronted by a cat. Kobe glanced around, trying to find a friendly face, any means of escape, but the entire class was carefully not looking in their direction, carrying on their own conversations even though their attention was clearly on this oddity on his desk in the front of the classroom. He gulped and turned his eyes back to the girl. She hopped off his desk and took one step toward him, her far too tight white button-down coming rather too close to his face for comfort. Her navy blue tie was broken only by the golden tie pin that secured it to her shirt, providing a contrasting curve to the white behind it and leaving nothing to his imagination. His face reddened and he tried to lean back a little further. Who are you? Do you need something? She smiled and leaned over him, bringing their faces closer. I noticed you hang out with a certain someone with a straw hat. She lifted her hand and his eyes riveted to the piece of paper between her first two fingers. His attention elsewhere, it gave her the chance to lean toward his ear, orange hair falling to hide her mouth, and say quietly, I was hoping you would be willing to deliver a message. She blinked down in surprise at where he'd fallen off the desk, having been leaning so far back that he'd flipped over it. I am sorry. She stared at the doorway in shock as he vanished, his voice trailing behind him. Her face twisted into a frown and she'd sked. What the hell was that? Does he not know how to act around women? But then where could he be running off to? A sly smile slid across her face, or better yet, who could he be running off to? That smile stayed on her face as she sauntered out of the classroom, leaving a great many wide, staring eyes behind her. Luffy-senpai. Zoro opened his eyes and glanced past the gleam of his sword to see Kobe's diminutive figure jogging toward them. He turned to say over his bare shoulder, Hey, Luffy. Luffy looked at him in the middle of swinging a mace around wildly. Huh? Then he gave a faintly panicked grimace when the mace slid out of his fingers and flew straight into Zoro's bandaged side. Ah! Zoro curled his body around the left side of his chest as best he could, then glared at his captain. What the hell was that for? Luffy held his hands up and waved them placatingly. I'm sorry. It slipped. But his gaze was drawn up as he caught movement behind Zoro's hunched form and he smiled. Oh. He raised his voice and waved, Hey, Kobe! Then he suddenly leaped up and back as Zoro took a swing at him with his sword. Luffy grabbed his hat as he felt it trying to fly off and pushed it back onto his head as he said, Whoa, wait, Zoro. A wicked grin slid across the swordsman's face. Not this time, Captain. He drew his other two swords, gripping the hilt of one between his teeth, and settled into a stance Luffy recalled from the fight in the alley. So when Luffy landed, he raised his head, one hand still securing his hat to it, and grinned. Is that so? Kobe hugged the wall, terrified of the power display taking place before him. He knew Luffy had skills beyond a first year, but to see him pitted barehanded against an armed Roronoa Zoro, he had greatly underestimated them both. Luffy leaned back, Zoro's sword passing within centimeters of his nose. He pushed through his foot to launch himself into the air in a horizontal spin, avoiding the swipe at his legs that the swordsman had taken. Grinning, Luffy landed on his hands and spun his legs in a circle, trying to knock Zoro's swords away. Zoro flipped his grip around and stopped Luffy's kick with the back of his sword, then pushed back to throw the boy off balance. Luffy allowed himself to lean back with the force of the shove, landing in a crouch, hands still braced against the ground. He lifted his head and grinned. Zoro's lips pulled into a wicked smile around the hilt between his teeth, and he surged forward. A severe gust of wind blasted from the middle of the field, clearing it of the dirt cloud the two fighters had kicked up and slamming something against the wall beside Kobe. Zoro stood in the field alone, half crouched, both arms held out to either side of him, swords gleaming in the sun. Kobe looked to his right and found Luffy down on one knee, breathing heavily, one arm resting on his knee and the other fisted against the ground to prop himself up. Zoro stood and dropped the sword from his mouth into his hand, then sheathed all three at once. He chuckled breathlessly and grinned. I can't believe you guarded against that. You're a total monster. Luffy grinned back and stood, brushing off his bare knees. You're quite the monster yourself. Sweat soaked the back of his standard-issue navy blue tank top and more than a few cuts peppered his black gym shorts, though he didn't appear to be bleeding anywhere. Well, that was quite the show. Kobe spun to his left and looked to the top of the wall he'd been hiding against. He stared fearfully at the source of the familiar voice. You. Nami grinned, an elbow resting on her knee and her chin propped in her hand. She was spinning Luffy's straw hat on the finger of her other hand. You're a hard man to find. When he didn't respond, she stopped spinning the hat and held the brim between her first two fingers, holding it up and sliding brown eyes sidelong to Luffy. I'd like to propose a partnership. Sengoku stared at the work request in his hand. A new door and frame? He shuffled through the other reports on his desk but eventually leaned back into his chair, frowning thoughtfully at the piece of paper in his hand. There were no incident reports for Harida's classroom in the past few weeks. What does he want a new door for? He contemplated the page a little while longer and then, reaching a decision, he stood and grabbed his admiral's jacket. A bell jingled near his knee and he smiled quietly to himself. Opening the door, he held it wide to allow for his pet goat to pass through alongside him, and they made their way out of the office. Harida's-san. Sengoku stared in shock at the gaping hole where the professor's classroom doorway had once been. What? How? He paused, jaw slowly dropping, then just pointed at the hole where his goat was sniffing curiously at the splintered wood. He turned his head to the other man and said, Explain. Hey, Admiral Sengoku. I didn't expect to see you today. Harida stroked at his long gray beard as he looked up from the papers he'd been grading on his podium and smiled. What brings you by? Sengoku gaped like a fish for a moment, then drew himself up and walked through the hole before him. His goat remained at the edges of it, pulling carefully at one of the planks of wood. Coming alongside the black-robed professor, Sengoku subconsciously stroked at his long braided goatee, mirroring the professor, and said, I came to see why you were requesting a new door, Harida's-san. What in the world happened to it? It looks like an explosion went off. Hey, it's not too bad. He shrugged. The young boy with the straw hat did not seem terribly mindful of the structural surroundings during his fight. He looked thoughtfully at the door, though he appeared to be using them to his advantage, so he was at least aware of them. He smiled at the admiral. Hey, no harm, no foul. I would leave it, but it can get awfully noisy without a door to block the hallway, and I think it would be best to replace it for my students' sakes. Sengoku's face had dropped into a bit of a grimace as he felt dread settle in his chest. Straw hat. You say? He held up his hand around mid-waist height. Was he about this tall, skinny kid, with shaggy black hair? He made a face and sighed out. And was he wearing flip-flops, by any chance? Harida laughed quietly. Why yes, he was wearing flip-flops. Sengoku shook his head, then walked out of the room and down the hall without another word. His goat finally snapped a plank out of the wall, and chewed on it happily as it trotted after him. You've got a call on the line, Admiral. Sengoku waved his thanks to the Marine saluting outside his office, then led himself and his goat into the quiet room, shutting the door behind them. The goat trotted over to its bed and settled down into the cushion eagerly, chewing contentedly on its piece of wood. Sengoku dropped into his leather chair and picked up the phone. Yes, this is Admiral Sengoku. Sengoku-sama. Sengoku winced and held the phone slightly further from his ear, saying with a sigh, Yes, Nezumi? Sengoku-sama. I need to report a very troublesome student to you. Sengoku felt a nascent headache beginning in his forehead, and he braced his elbows on his desk, leaning forward heavily. Let me guess, does he happen to wear a straw hat? Are you here to present complaints about a student? Tashigi blinked, eyes wide behind her glasses, hand relaxing slightly from her salute in her surprise. I am sorry, sir, but how did you know? Sengoku sighed and leaned back in his chair, one hand dropping to pet the furry head of the goat lying on the floor at his side. The animal's bell jingled as it chewed on a wide, thick leaf it had pulled from the plant sitting on the floor by the window. Tashigi could just barely see its horns peeking over the desk from her vantage point standing by the door. A well-educated guess. May I make another guess that this could potentially be about Monkey D. Luffy? Tashigi braced her feet and clasped her hands loosely behind her back. You would be correct, sir. Monkey D. Luffy has been absent from nearly every swordsmanship class since starting at this academy. Her lips firmed. He has also been using the equipment without proper supervision and has been seen sparring with another student, Roronoa Zoro. Her shoulders tightened. Sir, I'm concerned that he has fallen into a bad crowd and it is negatively influencing his academic integrity. Sengoku scratched a single finger in between his goat's horns, eliciting a happy noise and a friendly nudge from him. He glanced down with a quick smile at the animal, then looked back up at Tashigi with a faint frown. Thank you for your report, Tashigi-san. I am grateful that you have brought this to my attention. Tashigi saluted. Of course, sir. Is her brows furrowed in concern? Is there anything you would like me to do? I have considered approaching Luffy-kun, but Sengoku waved a hand. No, it's all right. I don't want you to have to chase him down for a lecture. I have an idea of who is best suited to make him listen. Tashigi blinked in confusion, but merely saluted again and said, Yes, sir. She bowed to him and left. Sengoku groaned and leaned over his chair to pick up his goat, staring it in the face. What has he gotten me into? The goat merely wagged its short tail and licked the Admiral's nose in response. Your grandson is a complete menace, Garp. Sengoku gestured wildly with his free hand, though the other man couldn't see it. He's even worse than Ace. Where did you raise them? In a barn? No, you know what, don't answer that. I don't want to hear you say yes. He heard a laugh and a few muttered words on the other end of the line and grimaced. No, it is not funny, Garp. You need to get him in line. He's been destroying academy property, picking fights, and skipping his classes. If you don't straighten him out, then the board will expel him. So if you really want him to stick around, then you're going to have to figure it out soon. The petty pleasure he derived from hanging up the phone didn't make him happy, but it did provide a slightly brighter point to his day. Ah, hell. He makes it sound like the brat's been trying to bring the place down. Garp shook his head, then flipped his phone back open and dialed his right-hand man, who, of course, answered very promptly and immediately said, Garp-sama, we can't keep eyes on him. You perhaps trained him a little too well to take your place. Garp guffawed. Now that's my grandson. Pity it makes things harder for us. He smiled, then shook his head. What do you have for me on his friends, Bogart? He leaned back in his chair and turned to face the bank of windows behind his desk. He has two that he spends a great deal of time with, although there is a third who he has recently picked up. The first is the boy you threw coffee at. It wasn't on purpose, it was supposed to hit Luffy, whose name is Kobe. He's rather a model student, actually, who seems to have aspirations to join the naval program. Garp grinned, eyes twinkling mischievously. Oh ho, does he now? The second is Roronoa Zoro, a young swordsman who has made a name for himself as the pirate hunter by taking down some bounties despite not being in his apprenticeship yet. The third, Garp's brows raised curiously at Bogart's pause, is a woman named Nami. We don't have a lot of data on her, but what we do suggests she might be a thief. Garp frowned slightly. A thief? What the hell is Luffy doing with a thief? About that, Garp-sama, do you still have access to the Academy's records building? Kobe nearly jumped out of his seat when the classroom door slammed open. Looking up, he did jump out of his seat when he saw who was there. Zoro-senpai. Kobe blinked in confusion. He'd seen Zoro sweat before during training, but that was usually only after he'd been lifting enormously heavy weights for nearly an hour. For him to be sweating in the full school uniform and to have such an annoyed look on his face was very concerning. Kobe! Zoro stomped into the classroom and grabbed the front of the shorter boy's button-down shirt, lifting him past his desk effortlessly, and then beginning to drag him out of the room. You need to help me find Luffy. Zoro-senpai, wait. Kobe dug his heels into the ground and grabbed at the fist in his shirt. Ah? Zoro turned his gaze back to Kobe, his one raised green brow giving him a menacing look. I can't just leave in the middle of class. Zoro gazed around the room, taking in the young and terrified faces around him and the distinct lack of a professor, then looked back at Kobe and raised his other brow skeptically. Kobe's mouth firmed with determination. It's a self-study period that was declared by Captain Morgan, and no one is to leave before he comes back. Zoro sked, then starting dragging Kobe along again. We don't have the time to wait for the end of study hall, Kobe. I need you to help me find Luffy now. Kobe leaned back, hands pushing ineffectually at the unforgiving grip in his shirt. When they reached the doorway, Kobe flung his arms out and snagged his fingers around the doorframe. See Zoro-senpai. Zoro paused, the hems of his black jacket swinging to a stop around his hips, then sighed and turned his head to look over his shoulder at Kobe again, mouth quirked to the side. Fine. You've got 2 minutes. Figure out your cover story and let's go already. He released his grip and Kobe stumbled back into the classroom, barely catching himself from falling. He took a moment to catch his breath, wide eyes staring at the doorway from behind thick glasses, hands braced on his knees as he sucked in air. He isn't going to stop, is he? He sighed in defeat, letting his head hang briefly, then turned back to his desk with the intention of gathering his materials. But he froze when he realized that everyone was staring at him in stunned silence. He looked around for a friendly face but found none. He turned slowly to the class president and rubbed nervously at the back of his head. I need to be excused from the rest of the study hall. The other boy just stared at him for several moments, mouth agape, then raised a slightly quivering arm to point at Kobe's desk. Gee, go ahead. But he glanced at the rest of their classmates, at their shocked faces, at the way they leaned back from Kobe like he had the plague. The president's shoulders straightened a little. Looking back at Kobe, he continued, but don't expect us to cover for you with Captain Morgan. It'll be bad enough that we let you leave. Kobe waved his hands frantically in front of him. No. This is entirely my fault. Just he glanced around, thinking. Kobe! Kobe flinched slightly at Zoro's call, then walked quickly to his desk and started shoving his books, papers, and pens into his backpack haphazardly. As he did so, he continued, just tell Captain Morgan that you weren't able to stop me. I'll explain everything to him when I get back. I'm sure Zoro-senpai has a good reason for needing my help. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and started for the door, but paused halfway there and turned back like he was going to say something more. Time to go. Kobe's arms pinwheeled as Zoro stomped back in and grabbed the back of his collar, tugging him toward the doorway, nearly running from the room. But that's impossible. Zoro scared. Yeah, well, I guess not. He came to a stop and released Kobe's collar, causing the boy to stumble forward a few steps. Zoro's jacket rose and fell as he caught his breath, bare forearm resting comfortably on the hilts of his 3 swords, his shirt and jacket sleeves both rolled up past his elbows. The gates to the academy stood before them, students flowing in and out, the afternoon sun blazing against the black iron and radiating off the white pavement. Kobe braced his hands on his knees and panted, then turned wide eyes to the swordsman. But I thought, one gulping breath, she said she wanted a partnership to go after Buggy. Why in another would she take Luffy-senpai to him as a hostage? His glasses flashed in the sunlight as he adjusted them, pushing them more securely onto his face after the mad scramble from the classroom had knocked them loose. Zoro continued to scan the area around them, his unfriendly gaze keeping students from complaining that the two of them were standing in the middle of the path. His voice rumbled quietly as he replied, How would I know what goes on in that witch's head? All I know is that the last time we talked to her, she got a weird look on her face when Luffy said he was going to be the Pirate King. He watched the people around them like a hawk, eyes following the students as they passed into the academy grounds, and said absently, as if to himself, the next thing I knew, Yosaku was shaking me awake and telling me he'd heard Luffy had been taken. He blinked as something buzzed against his ribs, and he fished his phone out of his jacket's inner pocket. Flipping it open, he set it to speaker and said, Johnny, finally? Did you find where he is? Kobe flinched at the shout that emanated from the tiny speaker. Zoro Aniki, it's terrible. Buggy is going to hold court on Luffy. Zoro's brow raised skeptically. What? He glanced at Kobe, whose jaw had dropped, a high-pitched sound leaking quietly from his open throat. The smaller boy gaped for a moment, jaw working as he tried to find words until he finally stammered, CCCC court? But Luffy-senpai didn't do anything, did he? He reached out to grab the phone, dragging it closer to his face, Zoro's hand coming along with it. His pink brows creased in panicked indignation. Why would Buggy hold court on Luffy-senpai? That's impossible. Impossible. Impasse. Zoro rapped Kobe on the head, causing Kobe's hands to fly to the injury and released the phone. Zoro faced both him and the little black device, voice edged with impatience. Would one of you tell me why the hell you're both freaking out about court? Zoro Aniki. Johnny had quieted, but urgency still underlay his words. When Buggy holds court, he almost always makes an example of the guilty party by executing them in a flashy fashion. Zoro instinctively leaned closer to the phone, hand pressing down on Kobe's head for support as he yelled into the phone. What? It's bad, Aniki. It's really bad. He doesn't have much time left. Zoro's head bowed forward and his arms started shaking. Kobe glanced up at him with concern as he felt the trembling hand on his head. Zoro-senpai? He asked tentatively, only for Kobe to shrink away from the terrifying smile that had stretched across Zoro's sweating face, his green brow twitching as he muttered, That damn idiot. Zoro let go of Kobe's head and stood straight again, then said with quiet menace, Johnny, where the hell is Buggy holding court? They heard a gulp on the other end of the phone and Johnny said, I heard he's holding it at his dock warehouses right now. But Aniki, what AR? Zoro snapped the phone shut and shoved it back in his pocket, eyes raising to gaze at the white marble front of the academy for a moment before he turned to face Kobe again. That devilish rictus of a grin had Kobe worried. He instinctively leaned back as Zoro gripped the white hilt of one of his swords and turned his suddenly hungry gaze on Kobe. Get me to the docks. Wait, so what did you want me to get? The records on Luffy-kun and his friends, Garp-sama. Garp grimaced at the rows of file cabinets in front of him, then rubbed absently at the back of his head with his free hand. He sighed and muttered, this is going to be a pain. They should be separated by grade and then alphabetically. It shouldn't be that hard to find them. Garp made a face and mouthed silently, shouldn't be that hard to find them, then started scanning the cabinets. Really, Garp-sama, must you resort to mockery? Garp pouted, eyes sliding to the side as if he could look at the phone tucked against his head. Ah, shut up. You're not the one digging through papers for information on your grandson. There wasn't even a beat of silence before Bogart replied, no, I'm the one hunting down your grandson and keeping tabs on him. Garp chuckled, but didn't reply as he tucked the phone between his ear and shoulder and pulled open one of the drawers for first years. He muttered the names to himself as he passed them before. Aha, there you are, you rascal. Who in the world would file you under your first name, anyway? He pulled the folder out and stared at the plain manila cover contemplatively, then paged it open carelessly and scanned the contents. A tick started in his forehead. Ha ha! Your own lackey turned you in. What kind of an idiot captain are you anyway? Buggy held a hand to his stomach, tears leaking from his eyes at the force of his laughter. Luffy just frowned faintly at him, arms crossed over his chest as he sat behind the bars of the cage. Nami stood beside Buggy, face briefly betraying her annoyance with the crime lord until he turned to look at her. She planted a long-suffering expression on her face and said airily, he's the absolute worst, Buggy-sama. Completely useless and a total freeloader. She smiled charmingly, leaning forward, against her every instinct, in a display of adoration, not at all like you, of course. Which is why I decided it was time to switch sides. She tucked a stray strand of orange hair behind her ear as she tilted her head to consider both Buggy and Luffy. When I heard that you were offering a reward for him, I just couldn't help myself from jumping at the chance to work with you, Buggy-sama. Buggy did nothing short of preen. He stood up straighter and held his chin with one of his white-gloved hands, posing in what he was certain was a dashing fashion, though his cheap black suit ruined the attempt. Oh, well, you know, I'm always willing to show newcomers how it's done. There's just so much I have to teach. His eyes slid appreciatively over the cargo-stuffed warehouse and his gang members perched on various crates or dangling their feet over the edges of the catwalks. Nami ignored the laughter and praise coming from the sweaty minions around her and replied, why, of course. I wanted no one but the best teacher. Her brown eyes slid sidelong to Luffy in his surprisingly sturdy cage and she frowned, which definitely wasn't him. Buggy laughed and patted her on the shoulder consolingly. Luckily for Nami, he was looking at Luffy and didn't see her flash of disgust at the touch. He took a step past her and crouched, dusty black boots scuffing quietly at the concrete floor. I can't believe you ever deigned to work for this loser. He bent forward to peer at Luffy between the bars, placing his gloved hands on the top for balance. How does it feel knowing you were so stupid that you got tricked into a cage by your own crewmate? Luffy was still frowning at him, brows creasing as the frown deepened. His bangs slid across his eyes as he finally tilted his head and asked in confusion, aren't you a crime boss? Why do you wear a clown nose? Utter, horrified silence was the only response for several seconds. Nami was grimacing, a touch of real panic in her eyes. I told you not to say anything about his nose, you dumbass. She smiled tentatively and reached out hesitantly to touch the crime lord's shoulder. Buggy-sama, don't mind him. He's truly an idiot and doesn't have the faintest concept of how a real boss should be. She cut off as Buggy slammed a hand on top of the steel and concrete cage and yelled with indignation, I think it's time to hold court on this heathen. Nami's hands went clammy and her stomach dropped as deafening cheers rang out around her. This isn't how this was supposed to go. That little cretin, he is so dead, Garp-sama. I can't believe the shit he's been up to. Sengoku wasn't exaggerating. Garp slammed Luffy's folder on top of the cabinet and shoved the drawer shut, body nearly shaking with his anger. Garp-sama, I understand you're angry, but you should stay on point right now. If they find you looking through the records without permission. Garp snatched the phone off the top of the cabinet where he dropped it while flipping through Luffy's records. He smashed it against his cheek as he tugged open another of the first-year drawers. I'm going to kill him. He started thumbing through the folders furiously until he paused and growled. What the hell was the other first year's name? Buggy. Buggy turned to frown unhappily at where the warehouse door had burst open and snarled. Who the hell is that? What do you mean, who? It's the most beautiful pirate from the seas, of course. Olivia sauntered in, white cowboy hat reflecting the strong warehouse lights and only barely shadowing the nasty smile on her wide face. Or do I need to remind you? Buggy gave her a smug smile back. Oh, Olivia-sama. It's a true delight to see you again. He walked toward her, boots clicking loudly in the sudden silence, and stopped a few feet away so he could peer up at her curiously. I wasn't expecting you for another week, though, Olivia replied haughtily. Plans change, Buggy. Her smile slipped as she caught sight of what was behind Buggy, and she narrowed her eyes. I came at the right time, too. Were you planning on replacing me with this ugly little hussy? Nami clenched her teeth, resisting the absurd and sudden urge to look down at the school uniform she was wearing. Hussy? Ugly? Luffy burst out laughing. Thankful, Nami turned to kick at the cage, easily covering her initial reaction with fake indignation. Shut the hell up. Learn a little respect. Can't you see that she's the great pirate Olivia-sama? Luffy dropped into snickering, a mischievous grin remaining on his face as he slowly quieted and continued to observe from under the brim of his hat. Nami eyed him worriedly. Don't say anything about her looks. Don't say anything about her looks. Olivia raised a brow skeptically, but was mollified a little as Buggy laughed and jerked a thumb over his shoulder. I could never replace you, Olivia-sama. I just decided to take this little duckling under my wings since she so kindly offered her idiot boss to me for sacrifice. In fact, he turned to face the rest of the warehouse and his crew, greasy blue ponytails swinging as he threw his arms out. We should celebrate the arrival of our beautiful Olivia-sama. Men, get the drinks. Someone handed him a mug and he raised it, and to our new companion Nami as well. Let's feast. Zoro careened to a stop as Kobe halted in front of him. Swinging his arms wildly to prevent himself from tripping over the shorter boy, Zoro asked, What the hell? Why are we stopping? Kobe didn't reply, eyes wide behind his glasses. His white button-down was soaked in sweat, and he had been panting, but his breath had come to a halt as soon as he'd looked around the corner of the building. The docks were a warren of piers, warehouses, and shipbuilders' shops, all stacked around and on top of each other to fit haphazardly in the small strip of harbor space allotted by the city. It was such a confusion of buildings that Zoro wasn't the least bit surprised that crime was able to thrive under the nose of so much marine presence. Kobe had led them through the district with an unerring sense of direction, so it seemed strange that he had come to such a complete stop. Zoro glanced over his pink head to peer around the corner, and took in the strangely dressed people, the boxes they were moving, the sound of partying nearby, and then he spied the mark on the backs of their shirts. He placed a hand on Kobe's shoulder, causing the kid to flinch and glance up at him with fear. Zoro patted his shoulder reassuringly. Don't worry about it, I can take it from here. He grinned as he watched Olvida's crew walking in and out of the warehouse building, those going and carrying boxes and coming back out with mugs of what looked like beer. I'm sure that's where he is. No need for her to know you were ever here, Kobe. He patted the boy's shoulder again and trotted past him, making a beeline for the heavily trafficked door to the warehouse. Kobe stared after him apprehensively. He is so dead, Garp-sama. I know. Garp slammed the last drawer shut with a clang and swept the stack of folders off of the top of the gray cabinet in front of him. Tucking them securely under his arm, he stomped out of the records room, down the wide hall, and out of the building, making his way to the parking lot. Jerking open his car door, he tossed the folders on the plush leather passenger seat and slammed the door shut, fuming silently as he started the engine. Bogard took the hint and remained silent on the other end of the phone. Nami! Come on, have a drink, this is a celebration in your honor. Nami turned to face Buggy, a nervous smile on her face. Oh, Buggy-sama. Really, it's okay, I don't. Nami. Her body froze subconsciously at the quiet tone, and she felt a mug shoved into her unresisting grip as Buggy smiled again and threw his now free hand around her shoulders. His hot arm felt like a brand across her cold back. He tapped his mug against hers and laughed. There we go. Drink up, Nami. Suppressing the shivers trying to crawl up her spine, she stared at the mug in her hands. Maybe if I can distract him. She tightened her grip on the handle and knocked it back swiftly. She gasped in a breath when she was done, wiping the foam from her lips with the back of her hand as Buggy roared with laughter. Now that show it's done. Men, take a note from our newest member's skills. Buggy's many minions cheered, raising their own mugs in tribute. Someone refilled Nami's mug and winked at her. Way to go, Nami-chan. She smiled absently at the man and turned back to Buggy, rolling her sleeves up her forearm and tapping her mug against his as she winked. "Oh, but I'm still no match for you, Buggy-sama. Your parties are known throughout town as something to behold. I'd love to watch a master partier in action." Buggy laughed again, his bright blue ponytail sliding over his shoulder and down his back as he tipped his head back and drank. He slammed the mug on top of Luffy's cage and took a satisfying gulp of air. A white-gloved finger pointed at Nami's full mug as someone refilled his. "Back to you, newbie. Show me what you've got." "I'm sorry, Luffy-senpai." Kobe gripped his elbows tighter and hunched in a little more as he walked back to the academy. He felt terrible for turning away, but he'd done his part, right? Zoro had asked for his help and told him he could leave after they'd reached the warehouse. That was all they needed him for anyway, right? Besides, it's not like I can compete with their crazy strength. He stared miserably at the gray day, gray concrete, gray buildings, gray water, gray sky. It seemed to match his mood perfectly. Why do I feel like this? Garp was pacing behind his desk when Bogart opened the office door, the man's naval boots barely making a sound on the thick cream carpet as he went back and forth, back and forth. Bogart had barely taken a step into the room with his wing-tipped shoes before Garp snarled, "What the hell is that brat playing at? Is he trying to get expelled?" Bogart paused for a split second, then closed the door gently and took off his beige coat, revealing his immaculate gray suit underneath. Garp merely continued to pace, the veins in his forehead becoming more prominent with each step. Hanging the coat and his gray fedora on the coat rack, Bogart proceeded to take the stack of folders off the desk and slide into the red leather armchair in front of Garp's desk, paging through the contents briskly but without hurry. When he finished, he set the folders back down on the dark wooden desk and leaned back into the chair, placing one ankle on the opposite knee. "It's not all that bad, Garp-sama." Garp spun incredulously to Bogart, slamming his hands on the desk as he asked, "Not that bad?" He poked violently at the folders. "Did you read these, Bogart?" He threw his hands in the air and looked up at the ceiling. He destroyed academy property, skips classes, fights with the student police force, uses the weapons without permission, and hangs out with a bunch of delinquents. Bogart placed his elbows on the arms of his leather chair and steepled his fingers before his mouth contemplatively. His keen eyes watched his employer's face as he said quietly, "Garp-sama, these acts are far less costly than the ones he performed on your own property before he went to school." Garp growled and slumped into his chair, dropping his chin into his hand as he grimaced across the desk at the other man. "That may be, but the academy doesn't deal with this behavior like I do. They'll expel him, and then all of that training will be wasted." Bogart picked up one of the folders and tossed it in front of Garp. The older man glanced down at it as Bogart leaned forward until he could tap the folder, murmuring, "I know you don't think your grandson plans ahead much, Garp-sama, but I believe Luffy may have an ulterior motive here." Kobe slid quickly behind some crates as he heard pounding footsteps coming down the dock. "I can't let them catch me here." He sat down, back to the wood, and took a few steadying breaths as he prayed, "Please, please, if anyone is listening, let them not see me." The footsteps got closer to the crate and passed by it, continuing down to the next dock. Kobe heaved a sigh of relief. "Thank you." Peeking around the corner of the wood, he looked toward where the footsteps were receding. "Zoro-senpai." Zoro skidded to a halt and spun. "Kobe? What the hell are you doing here? This can't be happening." Kobe gaped at him and asked, "Well, where are you going?" He pointed behind him. "The warehouse and Luffy are that way." Zoro cursed, expression twisting, and spun on his booted heels. Passing Kobe, he yelled over his shoulder, "Thanks." Kobe stared after him. "I know he's bad with directions, but if he got lost with the warehouse door in sight." His heart thundering painfully in his chest, stomach dropping, he called out, "Zoro-senpai, wait." Zoro peered over his shoulder as he continued running, one brow raising. "Ah, ha 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 ha." Buggy leaned heavily on the concrete top of the cage, snorting with laughter and gasping for breath. He lurched forward, pointing at Nami. "You're kidding." "And that actually worked?" Nami laughed and leaned back nonchalantly with a smug smile. "Of course it did. Men are a bunch of idiots except for you, of course, Buggy-sama. You're what men should be like, but alas, almost everyone falls short." She shrugged. A smile slid across Buggy's face. "Everyone else just disappoints, don't they?" He tapped on the concrete. "Take this guy, for example. You followed him because he made promises about what you'd get, didn't he? But then he didn't deliver." He bent to look at Luffy's pouting face through the steel bars, forearms still resting on the top of the cage and his blue hair swinging past his alcohol-reddened face. "Did you?" Buggy glanced back up when he felt Nami's hand on his arm as she flapped her other hand dismissively. "Oh, ignore him. He's a party pooper anyway, Buggy-sama, and we don't want him to spoil the celebration." Buggy's grin turned sly, Hey, you're right. He turned to face the rest of the warehouse and drew his arm out from under Nami's hand. Then he threw his arms wide and said, "What say we get this court up and running, men? It's time for a flashy execution to really round out this party." Nami's fingers clenched reflexively on the top of the concrete. Shit. She quickly plastered a look of drunken contentment back on her face as Buggy turned to face her, but failed to keep the look of surprise from flashing across her features when he continued, "And our executioner for today will be our new member Nami. This isn't happening, this isn't happening, this isn't happening." Kobe couldn't tell if it was making him feel any better, but he decided he didn't want to stop his internal mantra to find out. He was getting awfully hot in his academy uniform, the dress pants thick enough to make his legs feel on fire as he ran. But it was something he was only peripherally aware of as they came upon the corner where he'd previously left Zoro. "If I stop, I won't be able to get started again." And so, clenching his eyes shut, he pumped his legs faster and shot around the corner. "H. You can't do it, can you? Why the hell is he grinning?" Nami clenched her teeth, shoulders tensing as her grip tightened on the gun aimed at Luffy's head. That damn grin widened as he watched her, jeers ringing out around them. She felt buffeted on all sides by the sound, sweat dripping down the back of her neck as her breathing quickened. "Nami! Get on with it!" She could hear Buggy calling from behind her, voice growing impatient. "If I don't do this, and do it now, then he's going to kill me." She bit her lip as she felt her hand begin to shake. "Humph." Olivia grumbled and turned to Buggy. "Buggy, she doesn't have the guts. The ugly hussy is spineless." Buggy frowned, eyes half-lidded. Looks like I have my work cut out for me, doesn't it? Maybe she can't do it after all." Nami felt a flutter of hope, and then she felt a grip slide around hers and a chin rest on her shoulder as Buggy muttered with quiet menace beside her ear, "You do it like this, sweetheart." Her heart stopped as he raised their joined hands, aimed the muzzle, and fired. Zoro didn't take the door. Zoro didn't want to take the door. Zoro was hot and tired and very ready to beat up his captain for getting them into this mess, and more than a little annoyed that he kept getting lost. So no, Zoro didn't take the door. Instead, Zoro drew his swords with a vicious grin and made a door. Something exploded somewhere else in the warehouse and there was dust and debris everywhere. At least she didn't have to look at her handiwork. Nami coughed and stumbled back, trying to release the gun, but her grip was still trapped between it and Buggy's white-gloved hand. His other hand gripped her shoulder as she tripped over her own shoes and fell into him, leaning into his chest. She turned her head away as she heard him yell toward the doorway. What the hell was that? They heard screams coming from the cloud of dust, and then the sound of scattered gunshots. Nami glanced up at the noise fearfully, flinching with every shot, an image in her head of that straw hat falling. Buggy dumped her to the floor as he yanked the gun out of her hand and stepped over her to stare into the slowly falling dust with a grumpy frown. "Oi, guys! Tell me what's happening!" There were a few more screams, and then one of his men scrambled out of the dust on all fours, eyes wide as he said, "Be Buggy-sama, it's," only for a sword to descend from the dust and into his back. Nami felt the blood drain from her face at the crimson that pooled on the floor beneath the man, as if she was the one bleeding and not him. She flinched again at the sound of gunshots, Buggy firing at the shadowy mass that stemmed from the hilt of the sword. The shadow was gone as quickly as it had been there, but what little she'd seen, it couldn't be, could it? But even if it was, he was too late. Kobe just stared, floored yet again, by just how severely he'd underestimated the crazy people who had recently descended upon his life. Zoro was easily a one-man army, easily. Kobe gulped at the screams that emanated from the shattered hole in the warehouse wall. "No one is coming out." He suddenly slapped both his cheeks lightly. "Get it together, Kobe. Zoro is keeping them busy, so what can you do?" He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and then scrambled determinedly through the gap and into the chaos. "This isn't happening, this isn't happening. Who the hell is there?" Buggy was still pointing the gun at the slowly dissipating dust, eyes scanning for the sword-wielding shadow that was apparently ripping through his gang like they were wet paper, and making a mess of his warehouse in the process. He hated cleaning up messes. "Buggy," keeping the gun aimed, he turned to look at Olivia grumpily. "What is it?" One of Olivia's lackeys had brought her mace and handed it over to her. She lifted the spiked weapon to rest on her shoulder and grinned, white cowboy hat miraculously unscathed by the flying debris and dirt. "It's clearing up. Once it does, let me handle this." Her eyelids dropped, half-lidded and making her look like a well-pleased cat. "Well, if she's offering to go into close combat with that maniac," he gave her a greasy smile and sketched a bow. "Of course, Olivia-sama. I wouldn't dream of denying you the pleasure of schooling our party crasher." As she walked toward him, he realized that Nami had vanished from where he'd dropped her. He sneered at where he'd last seen her, no guts at all. Good riddance, kid. You're obviously not cut out for this life. Although it would have been nice if you'd stuck around a while, he schooled his expression as Olivia drew alongside him, and they stood together, watching and waiting for the dust to settle. It didn't take as long as he'd expected. What it revealed, though, was what he expected, based on the screams that had died off a few minutes ago. He immediately started assessing the damage. The broken wall I can handle. That shouldn't be too hard to get fixed. His gaze roved over the floor and his lip raised in disgust. Getting blood out of concrete is a bitch. But maybe I can paint over it? That would certainly be cheaper. And then he found the figure walking slowly toward them, and his eyes narrowed. Damn it, Zoro breathed carefully, aware of the tenuous position his ribs had in his chest. He was beginning to regret the bounty that had given him broken ribs. Taking the place of that little girl with the student police force hadn't helped, but he couldn't find it in him to regret that. He huffed a wry sigh. It really is just my luck to have followed a captain who was kidnapped by Buggy and Olivia within a few weeks of me joining. His dance in the dust hadn't led to any clues of Luffy's whereabouts, though, which meant that the kid wasn't on this side of the warehouse. He felt sweat drop down his cheek, his chest tightening painfully, but he ignored them both as he sized up his enemies. He'd never seen Buggy in person, but the man wasn't hard to recognize with that slightly greasy blue hair, the big red nose, and the cheap black suit. Of course, the crime lord was dwarfed by the pirate beside him. Physically, Olivia towered over the man, despite what Zoro could see of Buggy's physique beneath the badly tailored suit. As far as personality, though, it felt like Buggy was ceding the floor to her, which puzzled Zoro until he saw the spiked club Olivia was wielding. He grinned slowly around the white hilt gripped between his teeth as he deliberately raised his right arm to point his sword at her. Pirate Olivia, worth 5 million berries. He moved his arm slightly to point his sword at Buggy. Crime Lord Buggy the Clown, worth 15 million berries. He smirked around the hilt in his mouth. A 20 million berry payday sounds pretty good right about now. Buggy laughed derisively. You really think you can take us down? Just try it, pirate hunter. He placed his white-gloved hands on his black-clad hips, facing Zoro, and jerked his chin at Olivia. You've put Iron Club Olivia in a bad mood. Fighting the rising nausea, Nami jogged as quietly as she could down the warehouse hallway, making her way to the only office in the entire building. Zoro had provided a wonderful distraction for her to get to the safe, but she couldn't for the life of her get the image out of her head of Luffy's stupid grin right before the bullet whipped his head. She shook herself. He's an idiot who would have died anyway. Wanting to be the pirate king. Pirates are trash that should all be burned. She clenched her teeth, trying to ignore the way her gut kept trying to disagree with her head, and grabbed the handle to the office door. She paused, holding her breath to listen, and then, hearing no movement on the other side of the door, she quickly slipped in and closed it silently behind her. Cracking the safe was a matter of a few moments, and she was pleased to find stacks of cash sitting inside. Very pleased. She tugged each wad out, slipping them into the thin cloth bag she'd tucked into the band of her skirt. She was about to tie the bag shut when she caught sight of a roll of paper tucked in the back of the safe. She paused, mind racing. Glancing back at the door, she felt confident in her remaining time frame and pulled the paper out, scanning its contents quickly as she unrolled it. A sly grin stretched across her face and she rolled it back shut, shoving it in her cloth bag with the money and sliding the strap over her shoulder as she stood and left the office. Brown eyes scanned the hallway, but she didn't see any doors leading outside nearby. Her face twisted with a slightly queasy grimace. If there's no door here, then I'll have to go back to the main warehouse. She shook her head. Snap out of it. You're so close to the payment amount. She squared her shoulders and jogged back the way she had come, back to where the fight was still taking place, back to that falling straw hat. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. Kobe ignored the splinters that worked their ways into his questing hands, the pieces of wood and stone that he stubbed his toes on, and he definitely ignored the softer things he tripped over and the puddles he stepped in. He was just glad he couldn't really see them, although admittedly, it did make it harder for him to find Luffy. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. He squinted through the slowly dissipating dust, trying to make out the shapes of the shadows ahead of him. If he just pretended that they were unconscious, he could get through this, right? The puddles were just water. It's not like the copper tang in the air was from blood. He took a deep breath through his mouth in a vain effort to calm his breathing, and continued his search. He could vaguely hear the sound of Zoro taking on Olivia in another part of the warehouse, but he'd worked his way far enough around that the clashing weapons echoed back to him strangely. No more bodies on the floor here, thank goodness. Then he saw the straw hat, sitting like a piece of treasure in the middle of the concrete floor. He bent to pick it up, Luffy loves this thing, he wouldn't let it go flying if he could help it. I'll hold onto it for him. He held the brim tightly, and then his gaze was drawn up by a sound, and he saw a concrete, an iron cage. And what was in it? Shit! Zoro choked back the blood that was trying to come up his throat. Not now, damn it! He spun and shoved, tossing Olvida's club off his swords and forcing her to stumble a few steps backward. Normally he would have pressed his advantage, but he took those few precious moments to catch his breath and focus on getting the black of unconsciousness to stop encroaching into his vision. He would never let his ribs get broken again. His idiot of a captain would laugh himself to death if he could see how poorly Zoro was doing against a woman who had raw strength and no skill to speak of. Zoro cracked a grin. Just imagining that stupid kid's laughing face made him want to cut something. Not bad motivation, Captain. He took a couple more deep breaths in the time it took Olvida to plant her feet and regain balance. His eyes flicked past her jean-jacketed torso to glance at Buggy. The man still had a smug smile on his face that Zoro didn't like. He was certain that the crime lord was planning something, but his suspicions had to take a back seat as he re-engaged with Olvida. Her club landed again on his swords and he glared at it balefully. I'm really getting tired of this thing. Time to get rid of it. He shifted his feet for better thrust, then spun again, knocking her club into the air. But this time, he did press his advantage, using the momentum of his spin to swing full circle and hit her right in the gut. With the backs of his swords, though, bounties could drop by as much as 30% if the target wasn't alive. Olvida, of course, dropped like a stone. 5 million wasn't much as far as pirate bounties went, and Zoro didn't think she had very much combat experience based on her fighting skills. He doubted she'd had much practice with getting injured either. The tips of his swords just barely hovered off the concrete floor as he took several deep breaths. He lifted one and poked at Olvida experimentally with the tip until he was satisfied she was out cold. Turning to face Buggy, he was increasingly unnerved by that still remaining smile. So of course, his suspicions were confirmed by the cannon that was being rolled up by his minions from behind the clown-nosed man. His teeth clenched reflexively on the white hilt of his sword. It was just one of those days. Nami hadn't thought it was possible for her stomach to drop any further, but that was before she saw Buggy's favorite weapon come out to play. She'd heard enough rumors of his buggy balls to know that Zoro didn't have a chance of getting out of this one on his own. He was insanely strong and ridiculously fast, but it looked like Buggy had put enough distance between them that Zoro's chances were nil. He's just another stupid pirate who is going to die. I should leave all these disgusting criminals to their games and just get out of here. And yet her feet refused to move. She looked around wildly, hoping for anything she could use to distract Buggy long enough to let Zoro flee. Movement on the other side of the warehouse caught her eyes, and before she could avert her gaze from the evidence of her sin, she saw what was there. Her jaw dropped, and then a shaky smile wobbled across her features. Well now, isn't this a surprise? 2 executions in one day. Buggy threw one of his hands back to gesture at the massive cannon behind him. And I even get to use my favorite buggy balls for round 2. Ahaha. He placed his other hand on his hip and gave Zoro a derisive grin. Any last words, pirate hunter? Zoro sucked air in like he was going to reply, but then his gaze flickered to Buggy's right and narrowed. Buggy glared at him in confusion until he heard, Buggy-sama. Nami was breathless as she ran up to him. Buggy eyed her with distaste and leaned back as she came closer. Nami? Where the hell have you been? Nami leaned on her knees, saying between breaths, I thought someone should guard the back door. She dumped a blood-stained cloth bag at his feet, a bloody dagger clattering to the ground next to it. She turned her head up to give the man a simpering look, tamping all her rage and disgust deep, deep down. Then she gave him a satisfied smile. I caught some bastard trying to sneak away with all of your money. So I took care of him the way I thought you would. Buggy stared incredulously at the bag before his gaze raised suspiciously to rake over Nami. Her hands were indeed bloody. He could see flecks of crimson on her white button-down and peppered across her face. If she's telling the truth, he eyed the bag. But if she's not, he gave her a satisfied smile back. Oh ho, well thank you, Nami. That was well done of you. He watched her expression carefully as she preened at the praise, but he couldn't detect anything other than sincerity. Whether that was the case or not, his next step was clear. His eyelids lowered as he grinned and wrapped an arm around her shoulders, turning her to face Roronoa Zoro. Nami, say hello to our second guest of the day. He gestured with his free hand, as if the only man left standing on that side of the warehouse wasn't who he was obviously talking about, and continued, Roronoa Zoro, the so-called pirate hunter. It seems he's here to collect bounties. Nami rested her wrist on her hip. Humph. That's not all, Buggy-sama. He's the only other member of my old boss's crew. I bet he came here to get him back. She took several steps forward, Buggy's suit jacket swinging as she stepped out from beneath his arm. She stared smugly at Zoro. You're too late, swordsman. She raised her hand flippantly in front of her, as if brushing something away. Luffy is already dead. She leaned forward slightly and said with quiet menace, I shot him myself. Zoro's eyes widened, and then they immediately narrowed again. He deliberately dropped his white sword Wado Ikimanji from his mouth into his hand and said, That damn idiot. I told Luffy we shouldn't trust you. Nothing good comes from trusting a thieving witch. Ha! Nami turned and strutted back to Buggy, draping her arms over one of his shoulders and leaning on him. Only a thieving witch to weak mean like you and that kid. I only take orders from real men. Buggy hummed thoughtfully, Nami's one of us now, Roronoa. He grinned suddenly, and I think I know the perfect way to execute you. He placed a gloved hand on Nami's white-clad back and turned her toward the cannon, producing a box of matches in his other hand. Nami, you deserve the honor of wiping out the rest of your old crew, don't you think? Nami felt a thrill of fear that she struggled to contain, but she could feel his eyes on her, so she chuckled nervously and said, Me? Oh, you honor me too much today, Buggy-sama. She took the proffered matchbox and pivoted slowly on her heel as she came to the back of the cannon so she could face the fuse. And her target, Zoro, would just have to be fast enough. Kobe watched the scene play out before him and caught the flash of light off of whatever Nami showed Zoro when she appeared to be taunting him. Realizing what it must be, he started working his way around to the back of the cannon. He needed to be as close to Nami as possible, as soon as possible. Zoro didn't waste time. He started walking toward the cannon slowly, drawing everyone's gaze to him. Buggy narrowed his eyes suspiciously and nonchalantly sauntered around so that he was behind the cannon as he spoke. What's this, now? Are you coming to beg, Roronoa? Beg for your life? Zoro sheathed all three of his swords and gave him a devilish grin. Not in a million years, Buggy the clown. He kept walking closer slowly, each step deliberate. Half of the minions who had wheeled the cannon out raised their guns. That's close enough, pirate hunter, one of them called. A series of clicks resounded as they all cocked their weapons. Buggy started laughing. Oh, this is too rich. If you're not coming to beg for your life, then are you hoping you'll be shot full of holes before we explode you? Is that it? He placed a hand on the thick iron tube of his cannon. Are you afraid of my wonderful buggy balls? Humph, buggy balls? What the hell are those? Zoro slid his hands into the pockets of his black slacks, shoulders relaxing as his grin widened. I don't think I'll worry too much about something that has such a ridiculous name. He snickered and muttered, Buggy balls? Really? Several of the men stepped forward menacingly, and Zoro finally came to a stop, half ringed by guns. His gaze slid contemplatively over each of them, that easy smile still gracing his features. You sure you want to do this? Your boss seems to be missing something. They each stared at him in confusion, but didn't turn around. They weren't that stupid. Hey, big nose, but that got their attention. They all spun to stare with horror at the source of the shout. Even as he laughed, Zoro made sure they paid dearly for the lapse. Buggy barely had time to turn toward the voice. There's no way. Then he got a blow to the small of his back that threw him to his hands and knees. Twisting to look at his assailant, he hissed at Nami, You're dead, girl. She stuck her tongue out at him, then turned tail and ran toward Roronoa, snagging the bag of cash off the ground with her staff as she went. Clown Fea Haze. Buggy gritted his teeth and spun to look toward the voice again, but all he met was a fist to the cheek that sent him flying a few dozen feet across the floor. He rolled until his back slammed into a bunch of crates, smashing through them. What the hell? He coughed and spit blood from where he bit his cheek during his roll, struggling to sit up. Just who is this kid? Those fools weren't just being idiots when they said he was crazy strong for a first year. He leaned forward to drape his arm over his raised knee, panting to catch his breath. And there stood Luffy, laughing triumphantly by the cannon, some pink-haired kid standing a gappy behind him. Buggy scanned the warehouse, but it looked like all of his men were down for the count. He growled, Useless pieces of trash. If only I hadn't sent Kabeji and Moji to make that delivery today, these punks wouldn't stand a chance against the three of us. He watched as the four of them converged around Roronoa, the straw-hatted oaf laughing as he slapped a hand on the swordsman's back. Buggy eyed the green-haired man's jerk reaction with interest. He smiled and stood. Ha ha! Zoro! Nami! Luffy walked toward them and slapped Zoro on the back as he came closer. Zoro's eyes bulged and his entire body tensed as black started to creep around his vision again. He swung an arm at his captain, but the boy dodged it easily. Zoro hissed out, What the hell? His other hand clutched at his chest and he bent forward as carefully as he could, taking breaths in through his nose, out through his mouth. Eh? Luffy tilted his head curiously. He rubbed his chin contemplatively, brows furrowed in puzzlement, then he turned to say over his shoulder, "Hey Kobe." Kobe trotted up to them and peered at Zoro. "Zoro-senpai." He bent to get a better look at his chest, and gently pulled Zoro's hand away from his ribs. Noting the blood on his lips, Kobe frowned and said over his shoulder without looking away, "Luffy-senpai, Zoro-senpai needs real medical attention. I can try to patch him up for transport to a hospital, but it's not going to be enough if we don't get him to a doctor." Kobe started unbuttoning Zoro's blood-splattered shirt so that he could get a better look at his chest to see what kind of skin coloration he had over his ribs. Instead, it gave him the perfect vantage point to watch a knife tip push itself out of his abdomen as he was stabbed from behind. Kobe and Nami both yelled, "Zoro!" Luffy's eyes widened at the spray of blood that came from his swordsman. Kobe had fallen backward, jaw dropping as his eyes slid behind Zoro, and saw nothing. There was no one there. Had the knife been thrown? Nami stood a few feet behind Zoro, hands covering her mouth in horror. She seemed to be staring at the knife in his back, but rather than moving closer, she appeared to be backing away, heel boots scuffing along the gritty concrete as she did. Something in her expression changed as she stared, and she spun with fury toward the rest of the warehouse, raising her staff in a defensive position as she tried to split her attention between Zoro and their surroundings. She clenched her teeth and ground out, "The bastard has taken devil fruit." Buggy's cackling echoed from the other side of the warehouse, and there was an awful squelching noise as the knife retracted from Zoro's back. The green-haired man groaned and stumbled forward a step, landing heavily on one knee as he wheezed. Kobe started to scramble toward him to try to staunch the bleeding, but he paused as his gaze was drawn by quick movement behind Zoro. There was a disembodied hand holding the bloodied knife that had just withdrawn from Zoro's back. "This isn't happening. This isn't happening." Kobe felt his gorge rising, but he choked the feeling down. "This isn't happening." The hand continued to recede and Kobe crawled closer to Zoro. His hands hovered around the wound, but he knew they wouldn't be enough. Eyes scanning frantically, he muttered, "Oh, screw it," and started pulling off his shirt. He wadded it up and pressed it firmly into the hole in the swordsman's stomach. Zoro merely grunted and slapped his own hand over the cloth as well. "Get my jacket." Kobe nodded and worked on pulling Zoro's jacket off, careful not to tug too tightly for fear of damaging the already half-broken man. He had just shoved the wad of black fabric against the hole in Zoro's back when Zoro shifted, glancing up at his captain as he said, Luffy's fists clenched reflexively as he locked eyes with him. A half-assed grin cracked its way across Zoro's face as he muttered, "Your turn." It didn't quite call for blood, but something about it made Kobe glad Luffy's devilish smile wasn't directed at him. Buggy felt a flush of satisfaction as Zoro dropped. It had taken more effort to stab him than he thought it would, but it was entirely worth having to sneak his hand past Nami. It was regrettable that he hadn't been able to stab two of them at a time, but at least this would keep them distracted. Now, on to the next one. He frowned as his gaze turned to the straw-hatted oaf. He was certain that he'd shot the kid dead center in the forehead, so why was he still alive? Had Nami somehow altered the shot? Had the kid merely been playing along when his head whipped back like that? Something about this stank. He wiggled his fingers contemplatively as his right hand reattached to his wrist. "No matter. I'll just have to do it by hand this time." He chuckled quietly to himself at his own joke, then started forward, intent on choosing the battleground himself. This was going to be fun. "Nami, what?" she snapped without turning around. She was cranky. Stealing from a crime lord? Sure. Beating up a pirate? Why not? Taking on someone with full-blown devil fruit powers? Hard pass. That drug was a bane to the existence of every normal human being on the planet, especially since its effects were unique and unknowable until someone had taken it. Even then, it could be difficult to catalog what the exact change was. She'd heard rumors that some people even turned into animals, but she hadn't credited them with much truth. But disembodied hands? Maybe she should revise her opinions of those rumors after all. She heard steps behind her, and then Luffy was walking past, stretching his neck from side to side as he loosened his muscles. He shucked his black jacket and tossed it behind him, somehow managing to drape it over Nami's staff as he said, "Stay with Zoro." She frowned at his dusty jacket, then raised brown eyes to watch his receding back. "Where are you going?" "I told you, he's taken devil fruit. We should be running away, not fighting." "We wouldn't get away," Luffy replied, crouching on one leg to stretch out the other. He switched to the other side. He attacked from across the warehouse. Nami flinched and clenched her teeth, but continued to press. You can't win, Luffy. I don't know how you managed to survive the bullet, but fighting a devil fruit user head-on is going to get you killed. He turned and grinned widely at her. Then so be it. But he pulled his arm across his chest in a stretch as he turned to face the rest of the warehouse again. I don't think I'll die. Nami's surge of frustration was immediately doused by Buggy's voice coming from before them. Is that so, punk? And what gives you that idea? He was leaning back nonchalantly against a stack of crates, silver blade flashing in the harsh light as he twirled his knife expertly in his right hand. His left arm was tucked across his chest as if his arms had been crossed. His gaze slid to watch them sidelong, a subtle grin tugging at his lips. Miss me, Nami? She took a subconscious step back, raising her staff a little bit higher, shaking it until Luffy's jacket finally hissed to the floor in a heap. Buggy chuckled, but didn't move any closer, merely shifting his focus back to the spinning knife in front of him. Luffy started walking toward him, his flip-flops slapping the concrete and echoing back from the stacks of wooden boxes around them. Buggy turned his head slightly to look at the boy and smirked. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Luffy ignored him, flexing his hands and rolling his wrists as he came closer. Buggy's bright blue ponytail fell over his shoulder as he tilted his head and said in a sing-song voice, Don't say I didn't warn you. There was a clatter of wood behind him and Luffy glanced back to find Nami hovering several inches off the ground, legs kicking as she clawed at the hand wrapped around her throat. His eyes widened and his mouth firmed as he turned back to Buggy. The man had taken a few steps forward, holding his arms out in a shrug, waving his knife in his right hand and showing that his left arm ended at his wrist. You kids just never lease. Luffy ran forward and decked him across the face. Buggy snorted as he stumbled back several feet until he landed on his ass, the knife dropping from his hand as he clutched at his face. There was a gasp and a thud as Nami was released, and she sucked in a breath, landing in a heap on the floor. She coughed raspily, one hand hovering around her throat and the other planted firmly on the ground to prop her up as her body heaved for air. Her hand inched toward her staff until she could wrap her fingers around it firmly. Then she slammed one end of it into the concrete and used it to help herself stand up. But she wasn't the only one getting back up. Now you've made me mad, you little shit. Buggy wiped his left thumb across his cheek and examined the fresh blood staining his white glove with irritation. He raised his gaze back up to glare at Luffy as he got back to his feet. I'd been going easy on you punks, but now I'm getting serious. He grinned wickedly as he pulled several more knives from his pockets, holding them between his fingers so they protruded like claws. You've made a mess of my warehouse, killed my men, taken out a business partner, screwed with me. His eyes flicked to Nami and tried to steal my money. His yellow eyes turned back to Luffy and the corner of his lip lifted in disgust. And that damn straw hat reminds me too much of that shithead Shanks. Luffy's fists lowered slightly, eyes widening. You know Shanks? Buggy snorted derisively. Know him? I was on the same crew as him, back in the day. Until that piece of crap ruined my life. He pointed one knife-riddled hand at Luffy's head. I tricked the crew into thinking I'd taken the devil fruit pills we'd gotten from a raid and was about to make off with the real ones when he startled me and I actually swallowed them. I was so surprised that I fell off the ship and into the water, and he had to pull me out because I couldn't swim anymore. Luffy tilted his head curiously, expression puzzled. So he saved your life? Buggy's face contorted in fury and he shouted, he wouldn't have had T.O. save me if he hadn't made me swallow those pills. He sucked in a breath between clenched teeth, closing his eyes momentarily to calm himself. Opening them again into slits, he hissed, but it sounds like you know him. Why is that, punk? How are you connected to that man? Luffy grinned and pulled his hat off to look at it. Shanks gave me this. It's my treasure. Pfft. Luffy looked up in puzzlement at Buggy and the man burst into full-blown laughter. You call that treasure? Ha! Buggy shook his head, a condescending grin on his face. You poor sod. I don't know what Shanks told you, but that ratty thing is nothing but trash. HRM, Luffy grumbled, shoving his hat back on his head with a grumpy frown and raising his fists again. He shifted his feet as he prepared to close the distance between them. Buggy waved a disembodied hand. None of that, now. You pieces of shit have royally screwed me over all afternoon, and it's time I taught you a lesson. He grinned. Luffy stared, mouth slightly agape, as Buggy's entire torso detached from his hips and raised itself into the air. The crinkled ends of his white shirt dangled next to the edges of his cheap black suit jacket. Buggy narrowed his eyes and flicked his gaze to look past the straw-hatted brat in front of him, now to get some payback. Dark hair swayed as Luffy turned to watch Buggy flash over him, the man's blue ponytail streaming behind him as he shot past and yelled gleefully, Namith! Nami screamed. Garp eyed the manila folders doubtfully. Ulterior motive? Bogard leaned forward some more and replied quietly, if you read between the lines, it makes quite a bit of sense. This one, he gestured to another of the folders, has the experience he'd need. And these two, he pointed to the other two folders, seem to have unexpected connections. On the surface, it looks like a hodgepodge group of hooligans, but if you consider the smaller signs, then it's very possible that Luffy is putting together this team with a specific purpose in mind. Garp leaned back to glare at the folders on his desk, then sat down heavily in his leather chair. He settled his elbows on the polished wood and linked his fingers in front of him. Planning something this elaborate doesn't sound like him, though. Bogard shrugged, relaxing back into his chair. I admit it's a tad unusual for him, but I've been considering his past, shall we say exploits, and I've found a remarkable trend. Garp's brows raised curiously, but he didn't reply, so Bogard continued, he acts like an idiot most of the time, but I'm wondering if it's a facade. The overarching consequences of his actions have been surprisingly in his favor, for it to all have been unintentional. Leather creaked as Garp leaned back into his chair, stroking his trimmed gray beard contemplatively. I suppose you do have a point. He reached forward and picked up one of the folders, opening it to scan the contents again. He grunted. I can see what you mean by unexpected connections. His eyes raised to watch Bogard from over the top of the folder. But if he really is planning something, then why is he skipping his classes and ditching followers so well? You said we weren't the only ones trying to track him. If he's planning what I think he's planning, then he would need time to scout and prepare without being followed. And the scouting would have to be done during all different times of the day, which may also explain why he hasn't come home since starting school. A deep hum rumbled from Garp, and he went back to scanning the folder skeptically. Kobe glanced up at Nami's scream and felt his heart stutter at the sight before him. This isn't happening. His breath quickened as Nami fled to the other end of the warehouse, Buggy's hysterically laughing torso following her through the air. He was swaying side to side like he was dancing as he called after her, "Oh Nami dear." Kobe slapped his hands over his ears and turned back to Zoro. Nope. This isn't happening. Ignoring everything else, Kobe went back to his work. Zoro was laid out on the ground, a red stain seeping into the gray concrete now that it had soaked through his jacket. The swordsman was breathing slowly and shallowly, chest barely lifting as air went in and out of his lungs. Kobe had finally gotten a good look at his ribs and wasn't pleased. The distorted flesh and green and purple skin indicated that his broken ribs had shifted way out of place. Zoro hadn't coughed any more blood, but Kobe was concerned that one of his ribs might have managed to puncture a lung. Of course, none of that would matter if he didn't get these holes closed. The amount of blood he'd lost had already made Zoro several shades paler than his usual tan glow. Kobe picked the needle back up and pinched the skin shut again with his bloodied hand. Zoro merely grunted at the sensation. Kobe took a steadying breath and whispered apologetically, "Sorry, Zoro-senpai." Zoro clenched his fists and hissed as Kobe continued to stitch him up. What the hell? Nami dodged around a stack of crates and careened down another corridor of boxes, heeled boots screeching as they slid across the gritty concrete. Buggy's laughter still trailed her. She glanced back, only to find him much closer than she thought he'd been. Nami. She faced forward again and shouted back an oh. Leave me alone. Luffy stared after Nami's and Buggy's retreating backs in confusion. He scratched absently at his cheek and frowned, eyes following the sounds the two were making as Nami fled throughout the warehouse. His finger froze on his cheek as he paused suddenly and blinked, then turned back to look behind him. He grinned. Ah, Nami. There was a thump and clattering behind her, but it was several more steps before Nami decided to look back. Buggy's torso had collapsed onto the floor, his face twisted and a high-pitched squeal leaking from his mouth. What? Nami stared at him. His knives were scattered about him, although it was a pity he hadn't managed to land on any of them. She eyed him warily, making sure all of his body parts were still there and relieved to find them all in the right places. Is this some kind of trick? She watched his twitching half-body for a moment, then squared her shoulders with determination and started running again, back toward him. She didn't bother slowing down as she got closer. 3 steps. 2, 1. She gritted her teeth and kicked him in the face with all her might. Luffy glanced back up when he heard a tremendous crash. Pieces of wood and rope flew through the air nearby. He stood up a little straighter, placing his leg back on the ground after delivering a kick to Buggy's lower half. A panting Nami rounded the corner of another of the ubiquitous stacks of boxes and braced a hand against them as she caught her breath. Her blue tie had come loose from its golden pin and gently waved in front of her with every breath. She seemed to be favoring her right leg, some blood smeared on the pale skin of her shin. Luffy grinned and waved at her. Hey, Nami! She glared at him, mouth opening to berate him for leaving her to be chased alone. But then her brown eyes dropped to the ground behind him and found the toppled-over shape of Buggy's hips and legs. She closed her mouth and stared at it in puzzlement, then raised her gaze back to him. Maybe he's not so stupid after all. She rolled her ankle experimentally and, satisfied, starting walking toward Luffy slowly. Reaching his side, she placed a hand on her hip and surveyed the warehouse. There were bodies everywhere, blood staining the concrete and providing a coppery counterpoint to the scent of hot dust and broken wood in the air. The many shattered crates had dumped various goods on the floor, from now broken sacks of flour to clothing to a heap of guns. Both halves of Buggy still appeared to be down for the count. They hadn't so much as twitched since being struck, and Nami felt the tension ease from her shoulders. I can't believe we survived. She glanced up as Luffy turned and headed to their left, back to where Kobe was stitching up Zoro. Nami hesitated for a moment. I'm the one who got them into this mess, would she be welcome? Then she saw her sack of cash near the green and pink-haired boys and immediately followed Luffy. Catching up to him, she trotted alongside him, hands clasped behind her back, asking curiously, "How'd you do it? Did you dodge? Huh?" Luffy turned his head to look at her blankly. Nami resisted the urge to roll her eyes, getting shot. "How did you avoid it?" "Oh." Luffy grinned. "I didn't. He hit me right in the forehead." He tapped the spot with his finger for emphasis, then crouched over Zoro as they came upon the two. Nami rolled her eyes and stared at his back, lips pursed. "He's bullshitting me. He wouldn't be alive after a shot to the head." She didn't like mysteries. Zoro's eyes slit open as a shadow dropped over him and he grinned weakly, facing his captain. "What took you so long?" Luffy chuckled, resting his elbows on his knees and rocking back on his heels. "How's it going?" Kobe sighed heavily and Luffy turned his head to the right to get a better look at what the other boy was doing. Zoro's stomach was smeared in blood, but it looked like Kobe had managed to get the exit wound stitched closed. It was still leaking a bit, but it was significantly better than before. Even so, Kobe grimaced and said quietly, "Luffy-senpai, I still need to get the other side closed, but I'm afraid to lay him on his stomach on account of his ribs." He pushed his glasses up, leaving a bloody fingerprint on the thick blue bridge as he scanned Zoro's chest. Luffy frowned thoughtfully and cocked his head, eyeing Zoro as well, expression curious. Then he reached forward and grasped Zoro's shoulders and heaved the man up into a sitting position. Zoro's face twisted, eyes widening. Luffy-senpai, what?" Luffy tugged Zoro toward him, careful not to put pressure on anything other than his shoulders, and peered over his back until he could see the wound there. Then he turned to grin back at Kobe. "Will this work?" Kobe stared at him, mouth hanging open. Zoro's face indicated his ribs might have shifted again, but he was still conscious, so it probably hadn't been too bad. He appeared to be gritting his teeth though, so they shouldn't keep him in this position for too long. Kobe squared his bare shoulders and grabbed his tools as he scooted around behind Zoro. "This will have to do. I'll get it shut as quickly as I can." There was a scuff behind them and Luffy turned to watch Nami walk back toward them after picking her staff up from where she dropped it when Buggy had started chasing her. She broke it down into 3 pieces and slotted each piece into a holster on her thigh under her skirt. Luffy's gaze followed her as she passed them and picked up her bag of money, slinging it over her shoulder by the straps. He stared quietly as she faced them and waved her hand. "I'm out of here. See you guys later." Zoro's eyes slid to the side, though his view was blocked by Luffy's head. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice was quiet, nearly inaudible, but Nami slowed to a stop nonetheless. She tilted her head to look over her shoulder and give them a sly smile. "What do you mean?" "We teamed up to steal Buggy's money and did just that." She hoisted her shoulder, and the bag slung over it for emphasis, then continued walking. "Our partnership is over." She turned her head to smile wickedly at them one last time as she finished. "See you guys around." Zoro scowled but didn't say anything more as Luffy merely laughed. "Done." Kobe wiped his forehead, careful not to get blood from his hands on his face, and smiled. "Now we should get you to a hospital, Zoro-senpai." He started stuffing his tools back in his backpack. "I can clean this all up later, but right now we should get out of here as quickly as possible." Tucking each item into various pockets, he continued, "Luffy-senpai, can you help me get him up?" He was surprised to hear Zoro answer, "I think that's going to have to wait, Kobe." Kobe glanced behind him to see Zoro now leaning back, hand thrown behind him to prop himself up. Luffy had stood and was ignoring them, facing the rest of the warehouse where the still shadows of bodies were scattered across the concrete. Except one of those shadows was moving. Kobe felt his heart rise into his throat as a large shadow rose and the clank of iron on concrete echoed throughout the warehouse. He scrambled to his feet, bare chest heaving with his quickened breaths, and stared wide-eyed as Olivia struggled to her feet. Her white cowboy hat was askew and her wavy black hair tumbled messily over the shoulders of her jean jacket. The streaks of pale dust along her pink plaid shirt gave the impression of cuts in the cloth, though Zoro had been careful not to give her any. Her pointed red fingernails clicked against her iron weapon as she planted a hand on the handle to brace herself. She turned her angry gaze on the three boys in front of her, and immediately honed in on Kobaye. The boy flinched, shivers traveling up his spine, sweat popping out along his skin. Eek! Olivia gave him a greasy smile and pointed her free hand at Luffy. What do you think you're doing, Kobe? Who gives you a place to sleep every night? Him? No. She jerked her thumb at herself. It's me. You'd be dead on the streets by now if I hadn't taken you in, you brat. Her voice dropped. So you had better take this fool out before I get really mad. Kobe turned slowly to face Luffy, finding the other boy smiling, hands propped on his hips laxly. He opened his mouth, trying to say something, anything to Luffy, but no sound was coming out. There was a clank as Olivia lifted her club and slammed the tip back into the ground to get their attention. Who's the most beautiful woman on the seas, Kobe? Why? His gaze was drawn again to Luffy. Luffy, who laughed and smiled through almost everything. Luffy, who had taken on a devil fruit user because the man had hurt his friend. Luffy, who pursued his dream to become the Pirate King even though he was stuck at the World Justice Academy. Luffy, who was walking toward Olivia with that easy smile still on his face. Luffy, who grinned in the face of death. Kobe's shoulders tightened and he clenched his eyes shut, took a deep breath, and shouted with all his might, "Not you, you old ugly hag. I'm he sucked in another breath. I'm going to become a marine and arrest evil pirates like you." Luffy burst out laughing and turned to face Kobe. Well said. Kobe's eyes widened as Olivia lifted her mace and swung down toward that straw hat. His arms flew forward of their own volition and he shouted with panic, "Luffy-senpai, look out!" The club landed, pushing Luffy into the ground. But then it stopped and Luffy was crouching, a different smile on his face, appearing for all the world as if he was fine. How had his skull not cracked? Why wasn't he bleeding? Heh. Luffy shoved upward, knocking the club back into the air and throwing Olivia off balance, then spun with his momentum to face the woman. Throwing both arms behind his back until they looked strangely elongated, he stepped forward and brought them forward again to slam the heels of his palms into Olivia's stomach, sending her flying across the floor despite her bulk. She skidded over the concrete, white shorts ripping as she tumbled. She didn't get back up. Luffy dusted his hands off with a satisfied chuckle and walked back toward Kobe. The pink-haired boy stared at him, mouth agape. Ho, how are you? Luffy chuckled and clapped a hand on his bare shoulder, pausing a moment to grin at his speechless friend before continuing past him. Crouching, he slung Zoro's arm over his shoulder and hoisted the swordsman to his feet, inadvertently knocking his straw hat off in the process. Ah! My hat! He started to drop Zoro's arm off his shoulders so he could turn to pick it up, but Kobe dashed forward first. I'll get it. He picked the hat up carefully, then scurried to his backpack and snatched it up as well, slinging both straps over his bare shoulders until it rested comfortably on his back. Luffy stood there for a moment and blinked blankly at him, Zoro's arm only half draped over his shoulder. Kobe held the hat against his chest and smiled. I'll keep it safe. Luffy returned his smile, then tugged Zoro's arm more securely over his shoulder. All right then. Unfortunately, he only took 2 steps forward before something rustled on the other side of the warehouse. They all paused and turned to face toward the right, eyes drawn to the coughing figure before them. It took a moment, but after clearing his throat, Buggy snarled, "Straw Hat." His voice seemed a little higher pitched than normal, his face pale with a coating of dust. He was whole again, all one coherent piece of human, and pointed a hand at the boys imperiously. How dare you do this to me? How dare you destroy my warehouse? You're going to pay for this. The corner of Luffy's lip pulled down in a slight frown and he let out a sigh. He started to step out from under Zoro's arm, but paused as he felt the man shift his weight onto his own feet and take a few steps forward. Zoro cocked a grin, sweat dripping down his face. You want more, clown? He rested a heavy hand on the hilts of his katanas. Buggy sneered, "Oh, the fearsome pirate hunter, Roronoa Zoro. As if you could beat me. You look half dead, punk." His sneer morphed into an angry grin. How about I help you become all dead? In fact, he turned his gaze to Kobe. Why don't I make you both dead? His hands detached from his body, knives suddenly appearing in his grips, and sped toward them as he cackled. Zoro gripped the white hilt of Wado Ikimanji more tightly, teeth gritting as he braced himself. Kobe shrieked, grip tightening reflexively on Luffy's hat as goosebumps rushed up his arms and across his torso, eyes riveted to the disembodied hand flying toward him. Then there was a boom behind them, a flash of something large and red speeding past, and suddenly the half of the warehouse they'd been facing was gone. Kobe stared, eyes wide and jaw hanging. The entire far wall of the warehouse was gone, as were the smaller ships Olivia's crew had used to dock in front of it. Planks of wood, pieces of rope, and strips of cloth floated on the gray sea, waves rocking out to either side from the path of the projectile. Turning ever so slowly, Kobe looked sideways at Zoro and met the swordsman's eyes as he did the same, Kobe's face mirrored on the older man's. In unison, they spun their gazes behind them to find Luffy standing behind Buggy's cannon, one hand held horizontally to his forehead as he peered at the hole, mouth around. Oh, wheel. They went pretty far, didn't they? Kobe blinked, then whipped back to look at the hole and realized the forms of both Olivia and Buggy were nowhere to be seen. Did he just blast them out of the way? Zoro grunted and dropped to a sit, one leg propped up and his arm draped over it as he chuckled shallowly and covered his face with his hand. Damn it, Luffy. I was going to collect their bounties. Luffy chuckled and grinned. Sorry. Zoro snickered, then sighed, but said nothing more. Kobe felt like he was going to pass out. Who the hell were these people? This isn't happening. Thanks for watching this video. You really enjoy this video. Like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. Don't forget to support and follow Olivia Wren for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. See you in the next video. Goodbye.